you listen to what people are saying. Listen to what newcomers, oldcomers, leaders, followers are saying, because when you articulate a vision for the future of your congregation, it's very important that it become a shared vision and that everyone could buy into the future of the congregation. Because unless your members of your congregation feel that the faith community has a future, you are not going to thrive, grow, and be a vital congregation actively engaging in God's mission in the world. So you may say, if vision is an aspirational statement, how does it move? How does it guide strategic goals? How does it become part of a kind of a very practical, thoughtful, prayerful process of determining who you are and what God is calling you to do? So, for example, at St. Mary's, they went from strengthening worship, building discipleship, and nurturing membership as kind of their vision of that they then articulated into specific, measurable goals and strategies. John Cotter, who wrote a very seminal book called Leading Change, says that vision plays a key role in producing useful change by helping to direct, align, and inspire actions on part of a large number of people. And without appropriate vision, a transformation effort dissolves into a list of confusing, incompatible, and time-consuming projects that go in the wrong direction or nowhere at all. So it's very important that when you engage in this process, you articulate a current mission or what you feel God is calling you to do and be in a particular time and place, and kind of a hopeful, aspirational vision that can be embraced by the wider community. Now, one of the things you're gonna hear tonight is that, what is the difference between strategic planning and strategic thinking? And what we often advocate and what we've done at our own organization is basically abandon the old model of a 3, 5, 10-year strategic plan. Not that we don't think strategic planning or the process of thinking strategically is important, but often a strategic plan has inherent problems for a variety of reasons. First of all, it often generates more goals than can be reasonably pursued. And I'm sure you have seen and even engaged in strategic plans that will say things like, we will double our size in the next 3 years. We will grow our endowment from $0 to $5 million. We will be the center for outreach and ministry in a particular neighborhood. Not that that kind of brainstorming or visioning is not helpful, but it does not constitute a strategic plan or a strategy approach that is actually measurable and achievable. The other thing is it often mistakes goals for strategies, and we'll talk about the difference in a minute. And the other problem with traditional strategic plans is it often expects strategies to fit into rigid timelines. And if we look at our congregation, our own personal lives for that matter, trying to fit goals and strategies into artificial timelines is often a frustrating experience. The other problem is it's often very difficult to forecast what's going to happen 3 to 5 years in the future, especially given the changing nature of our economy, our society, the church, the world. So it's little wonder that often people will engage in these very elaborate strategic planning processes, get overwhelmed by the final work product, and they sit on the shelf rather than become ongoing, living, breathing documents. So what is the alternative? Well, what we often advocate, what we do advocate is rather than a formal strategic planning process, although the planning process itself is still important, engage in ongoing strategic thinking. Now, the problem with the traditional process is the traditional process presupposes that you engage in 6 to 12 or 18 months of planning, and then you engage in a 3 to 5 year process of implementing. But when you look at your daily life and work, in essence, you're constantly engaging in thinking, planning, thinking, planning, thinking, planning. Therefore, you have to create a process that responds to that very dynamic, iterative, changing process. So what is real-time strategic thinking? And the key here is real-time, because it takes place in real time. It's an ongoing process. It's contextual, and this process responds to changing circumstances on a weekly, monthly, annual, if not daily basis. So it's iterative and ongoing. It identifies congregational goals that are aligned with the long-term vision. It identifies strategies for reaching those goals, and it evaluates long-term and short-term strategies in light of mission, financial capacity, and organizational uniqueness, and more. So the question you may have is, okay, this sounds all well and good, but how do we start this process of strategic thinking? And what I would suggest is at every vestry meeting, you have one question, a big question, an important question, a strategic question that you spend time on in a thoughtful, deliberate, iterative way, without necessarily coming up with solutions or strategies, but to start the exercise of strategic thinking. For example, the question for next month's vestry will be, how do we come up with a more relevant, dynamic process for conducting our annual stewardship campaign, given the fact that the last 5 years have been static? Another would be, we have an aging, deteriorating physical plant. Does our physical plant continue to serve the needs of this congregation? Are there alternatives to the current physical plant? Or are there creative ways of making sure that the buildings serve us rather than we serve the building? A third strategic conversation could be, how can we be more relevant to the changing demographics of our neighborhood? The idea is you start with these questions, you engage your leadership body in this kind of thinking, and then you slowly move from taking this strategic thinking into a few measurable goals and strategies. So let's move on to the next slide. So let's stop here with a few questions. What are your congregation's ministry strengths? That may also be a conversation to start you thinking about kind of strategic big picture issues. Does your congregation's mission and vision reflect those strengths? Look back again at the example of St. Mary's Cathedral. Does your congregation have a hopeful vision of the future? Have you engaged in that process of making sure that your constituents and your wider community are part of that process? If your congregation has a strategic plan, how frequently does it review its plan? So even if you do have a traditional strategic plan, is it something that you actually use as a living, breathing document, or is it something you put on your shelf? And then do you understand the difference between a hopeful vision, goals related to that vision, and strategies for achieving those goals? And we're going to talk about goals and strategies in a moment. Are there any questions at the moment before we move on to the next phase? There are a couple who are typing. I'll wait a second for that.
And again, as a reminder to everyone, you can type your questions in at any point during this webinar, but we invite you, especially at this time, if you have any questions for Donald, to go ahead and use the chat box to type in your questions.
And in a moment, we'll talk about how strategic thinking is operationalized into actual goals and strategies. And I'm not saying that a strategic planning process or even a traditional strategic plan is a bad thing to have. What I'm saying is that it needs to be an ongoing process. And if you do have a strategic plan, it has to be constantly reviewed, challenged, tweaked, and measured. What is your opinion of having a compelling vision? I think a compelling vision is critical. It's kind of a two-sided process. It's kind of almost right brain, left brain. On one hand, you want to be kind of very practical, very focused, very much, you want to be able to kind of say, this is who we are, this is what we're doing, this is what we feel called to be. On the other hand, a compelling vision is a way of engaging people in the long-term health and vitality of the community. And as I said earlier, unless a parish, an organization, a relationship has a compelling vision for the future, it's not going to grow, revitalize, or be a nurturing environment. But on the other hand, the process has to be inclusive. It has to represent and reflect the views of your diverse constituencies. And the vision does have to tie back to the mission, because ultimately you're going to be looking at the vision as an aspirational goal based on what you feel called to do and be in a particular time and place. Are we ready to move on a little bit? Okay. So the difference between goals and strategies. A goal is a specific and measurable statement of a desired result. Goals need to be specific, they need to be contextual, they need to be measurable, and a goal needs to lead to some kind of desired result. And we'll look at a few in a minute. The goal should be aligned with the overall vision of your congregation or faith community. It needs to be aligned with what you feel, who you are, and what God is calling you to do and be. Goals need to be grounded in a process, a thoughtful, prayerful process of discernment, and we'll talk more about discernment. And then goals are not enough. That you have to identify strategies for meeting those goals. And basically a strategy is a method or a way which an organization goes about achieving a goal. And we'll give you some specific examples in a moment. And I think sometimes, especially if you're a smaller congregation, if you're at a point of transition or if you're at a point of stuckedness, articulating your identity or your mission, casting a vision, and set a few medium to long-term goals, and then evaluating proposed strategies is a very it's a very manageable way of kind of moving from point A to point B. Because again, the problem with traditional strategic planning processes is that they often seem overwhelming. They seem big, they seem large, they seem out of control. So what we're advocating is a more simple and more contextual process that congregations of every size and shape could engage in. Basically focused around this ongoing process of strategic thinking and then moving to this next step. Are strategies the same as objectives in the world of planning? Well, often traditional strategic plans often they'll have goals, strategy, goals, objectives, action steps. I think sometimes objectives are often kind of rewritten versions of the goals. The idea of a strategy is that it's a more specific way of operationalizing your goal. The other thing about a strategy is that if a strategy isn't working, you can change it. So while strategies are similar to objectives, I would say objectives are more similar to goals and strategies are more similar to action steps in the traditional planning process. And we'll look at specific examples which might be a little more helpful. Okay, let's look at the process of evaluating proposed strategies. So, okay, let's say that you've engaged in strategic thinking, and it becomes very obvious early on in the process that you really need additional resources to meet the ministry needs of your congregation, of your neighborhood, of your buildings, of the world. So let's say you had a series of conversations on these questions I previously articulated. So you say, okay, we need to take all this wonderful stuff and funnel it into a particular goal. And the particular goal is increase funding for our ministries over the next 10 years. And it might not even be 10 years. It might be 2 years, 3 years, next year. So you kind of come up with, let's brainstorm some ideas. And you come up with annual fundraising events, or leveraging the building for rental income, or starting a small business enterprise that will generate revenue, or doing a capital campaign to fix the buildings or alleviate debt. Enhance your annual stewardship campaign. So you go through this list and you say, okay, what do we pick? And this is where it's helpful to determine criteria or screen. How do you screen out a good idea from a bad idea? How do you determine that? If you remember our friends at St. Mary's Cathedral, they came up with a list of criteria for determining how they were going to move forward with some of these ideas. So let's look at some possibilities. So what we often will suggest is that you develop a strategy filter. There are a lot of ideas out there. And and we kind of provide a lot of good ideas. I mean, our Vital Practices website is full of great ideas about a lot of ways of doing new ministries, supporting existing ministries. But when push comes to shove, you're going to have to look at your own specific situation and come up with your own specific criteria for determining, how to move forward with strategies for a particular goal. For example, does this support our mission and vision? Especially when it comes to fundraising strategies. Does an annual gala event or selling lemonade at the annual parade, does that support our mission and vision? Is this unique, or does it duplicate other people's work? Whether that's a fundraising strategy or an outreach strategy or a mission opportunity, if there are 5 other food pantries within 3 blocks of your church, does another food pantry make a lot of sense, or does it make sense to partner with your sister institutions? Is it financially sustainable through potential gifts or fees? A lot of times people start ministries, and that's a great thing, and often what we say is, do it on a pilot basis, do it on a trial basis, do it on a test basis, because because is it sustainable in the long run? Is it consistent with our identity? And that's why an identity statement is important. I mean, if you are in an urban downtown church in a multicultural setting, perhaps doing some kind of rural farming program may not be consistent with your identity, and perhaps your mission opportunities need to be more contextual and more local. And do you have the internal capacity to begin and sustain this initiative? This is a critical discussion item for small congregations. You need internal capacity, which means leadership capacity, financial capacity, space capacity, all those aspects that you need in order to make a ministry or a program operational. And we still have the fantasy as Episcopal congregations that we have to be all things to all people at all times, even though we're a small family-sized congregation. And that's why the strategy screen is very important. I think there's some questions here. How do you suggest we avoid redundancy in vision statements and mission statements? Well, one way of avoiding redundancy is when you articulate your mission statement or your list of things you do, that you be very specific and very honest with yourselves. And if you know, and when you articulate a vision statement, I mean, you know, back to the example. So, you know, we provide quality Christian formation programs, and the vision for that is we want to make disciples for Christ who are actively engaged in God's mission in the world. So if you do not provide, or you do not feel you're called to provide quality Christian formation, or you don't have the capacity or the people or the numbers, it doesn't make sense to articulate that as your mission or articulate that as your vision. You know, we nurture the children in our midst. And the vision is supporting the next generation of Christian leaders in our community. If you have no kids in your congregation, if you're in a community that's basically elderly or retired, perhaps your mission isn't about nurturing kids or creating the next generation of disciples and leaders. Your mission is about nurturing the people around us, the young retirees, to be active participants in the life of our community. So I think being honest, being specific, and making sure that you take the ideas of the wider community and articulate them in a realistic yet aspirational way. Okay. So when you're developing a strategy filter, look back at your mission and vision, and if you haven't engaged in that process of articulating your mission and vision, that's where you begin. Uniqueness. You know, I mentioned kind of the New York City parishes. You know, they'll say, well, we have a beautiful historic building, and I'll say, yes, but so do others. You know, we have a wonderful music program. Yes, so do others. I mean, you don't want to get, I mean, in some respects, people say, well, aren't you almost imposing kind of a secular competitive analysis on this process? I'm not suggesting that you are in competition with other churches, but somehow you have to distinguish who you are, what you're called to do, and why you are different than other faith communities. Because unless you engage in that process, you're not going to be able to engage in this ongoing process of this iterative strategic thinking and coming up with specific goals and strategies that will move forward. Financial sustainability is critical. And I'm not saying you get stuck on finances, because often people say, well, we don't have the money to do that, or there's not enough money there. If you come up with a mission and a vision and a goal and a strategy that you think is clearly on point in terms of who you are and what God is calling you to do, then the next step is, how do we raise the money for this, and how do we make this a sustainable operation, or how do we make this a pilot project through a test period, and then evaluate it for long-term sustainability. Back to identity. You saw St. Mary's. It was really important for St. Mary's to come up with that identity statement, because they were doing a lot of things. They were able to talk a lot about what they did or who they were, but they really needed to put it in a succinct statement. Goes back to the issue: are you urban? Are you rural? Are you multicultural? Are you large? Are you small? Are you in a Rust Belt town or Sun Belt town? I mean, identity is critical to every congregation. And then internal capacity. And I know some parishes will say, we will not start any new ministry unless and until a group of 2, 3, 4, 5 passionate lay people are ready to move forward with it. People will say that even in large corporate-sized parishes, this is not going to be staff-driven. Unless and until leadership bubbles up to make this happen, we're not going to do it. Okay. Let's see if there are any questions, Brendan, that I should address at this point.
Well, answered a few. We also had a comment from Dawn and saying that, feeling that most congregations have a hard time stating why they are there and what God is calling them to be. I don't know if you have any further thoughts or comments on that.
And the other thing is, while strategic things in meeting ongoing, some of the goals stem from this, can be longer. Yes, I agree. Yeah, I mean, it is a hard process, because it could also be a painful process. Because often I talk about this state of stuckedness, which is a wonderful theological term. I mean, often you'll be at a point, and this often happens in congregations that are in some sense of flux. It may be that they've lost membership, their demographics are changing, neighborhood is changing, they're starting to realize that they have building needs and resource needs. And at that point, it's very easy to say, oh my God, remember the good old days? Remember the good old days when we would have 500 people on Christmas Eve and 350 people in our Sunday school, even though the building only holds 150 people. But that's when you stop and say, okay, who are we? And it does not mean you neglect your history. And especially for parishes in our neck of the woods, in the Northeast, and a lot of places, history is very important. But one way to start that process is to have people tell their stories. You go around the room and you say, Donald, tell us about when you came to Trinity Church, how long you've been here, why you stay, and what are you most excited about? Having individual that, I mean, it's not it could be a fairly intense process. And then, 5 or 6 or 7 or 12 people tell their personal journeys, their personal stories. Then all of a sudden you say, gee, I see some trends here. I see the issue of welcoming. I see the issue of hospitality. I see the issue of diversity. I see the issue of worship that and preaching that touches people's hearts and minds. So then all of a sudden, from that process, you realize that we are a warm, welcoming, worshiping community that is nurtured and fed by being together. You start from specific stories, and then you move to community stories, and that's how you articulate your mission and vision. To the issue of goals, yes. The goals may be, so through this, so let's go back to the facing issue, which is obviously everybody's goal. So, you come to that goal through this ongoing iterative strategic thinking process, but you come up with specific strategies. So the specific strategy would be that, okay, let's say it's middle October. While we can't do a wholesale, revision of our annual stewardship process, we are going to add a telephone component to it, or we're going to call everybody and thank them for their pledge last year. So that's kind of an immediate goal with the strategy that takes place over the next 2 months. We are going to institute a year-wide stewardship program in 2016 where we talk about generosity and everything coming from an all-generous God. So that's a 1-year goal. We're going to look to a discernment process for a capital campaign in 2017. So that's, again, a 2-year goal. So it doesn't mean that you don't have longer-term goals, but it also means that if the capital campaign then becomes totally unrealistic, you take that off your list as a strategy and you come up with something different. Okay, Pamela, yeah. First of all, I guess you have to also question how effective search processes are weird animals, and people confuse search processes from strategic thinking, strategic planning processes. A search process, once again, is a snapshot in time, and we've all seen profiles, and sometimes a lot of profiles look alike because people do not articulate how they're unique and how they're different, and what their mission is and what their identity is and what their aspirations are. Because everyone often says, we are a warm, welcoming community, we are hospitable, we have wonderful worship, wonderful music, and we want a rector who's going to be a good preacher, a good teacher, who's going to inspire us, who's going to grow the congregation, who's going to make us more actively engaged in the neighborhood and bring about the coming of the kingdom in the next 3 years. Now, I know I'm being a little glib on that. Not that all those things are not important, and not that all those things at some point wind up in a profile. But through that process, you have to realize a profile is a snapshot in time. It's kind of like a dating service. You're trying to say, here's where I think I am right now, and here's the type of rector we think we need. And through a complicated process in the Holy Spirit, you have a match. But now that there's a match, and Pamela, now you've been there for 4 years, so it's more than a casual relationship at that point. Now that you're there, it's important to say, okay, I've been here for 4 years. We've done some things, some good things. Let's engage in this process because we have to determine, are we still the same place we were from 4 years ago? And I would say no, because you've had new clergy leadership for 4 years. And it's a good time to kind of step back and engage in this process, because through this process, we're going to get greater clarity, greater energy, greater enthusiasm, greater engagement, and actually, really through a discernment process, help determine what God is calling us to do and be. Which brings us to kind of next steps. Discernment is critical. And, we often think of discernment in terms of, big formal processes, discerning call to ordained ministry, discerning that your call of your next rector. Discernment is an ongoing process of kind of just, deciding what are we doing, who we are, how we are doing it, what do we do, what is God calling us to do. One way of engaging in discernment is through this kind of ongoing strategic process. But it has to be focused on prayer. It has to be focused on Bible study. And what we encourage all our vestries to do is to make sure that every vestry meeting has opportunities for prayer, Bible study, discernment, and if possible, sharing faith stories. Doesn't have to be all of those at all times, but it has to be a normal part of your process. Discerning strengths. You know, you saw the list of ministry strengths of St. Mary's Cathedral, and they had some strengths. I mean, clearly they had some resources. They had a nice building. They were well situated. They were in a growing downtown area. But everyone has strengths. It doesn't mean that you ignore the weaknesses, but through discerning strengths, you get to that point of helping to articulate your mission and then your vision. You know, this visioning process, describing a hopeful picture of what the church world would look like if you accomplish your mission. It's not a pie in the sky exercise. It could be very aspirational. It could be very hopeful. It could be very compelling. But as I said several times, it's a way of having people look to the future rather than look to the past. Because if you're only looking to the past and not the future, you don't have a future. And then identify a few major goals for 2015, I guess in this case 2016. And then spend the bulk of your time brainstorming strategies to achieve those goals, and then coming up with a screen to see what strategies you're going to move forward. There's nothing magic about having 5 goals or 10 goals. In fact, you might want to have 1, 2, or 3 goals. In fact, you may just decide that your goal for 2016 is, it could be finances, it could be engaging the congregation in the wider community, it could be something around worship or Christian formation. It doesn't have to be the laundry list of everything that needs to be accomplished before Jesus comes again. Because that's the process that frustrates people, that leads to plans that no one looks at, puts on shelves, and leads to frustration, burnout, and all those things we're trying to avoid. It is like appreciative inquiry. In fact, appreciative inquiry is one way of discerning your strengths. It's not the only way, but people find appreciative inquiry a helpful way of doing that. Again, there are other ways of doing it. A lot of it is contextual. A lot of it depends on the personality of your congregation or who your leadership is. Yes, for your 2 cents. I think it's important to have the right people and not necessarily the right time. Many good people just cannot see into the future to see what the church could look like in 3 to 5 years, my opinion. I agree with you. And this is kind of going off topic, and I'm looking at our time. But it's very important to have the right people on the bus. And when you're in the process of putting together a vestry, you want those people who do have the big picture. If someone's really, really passionate about buildings and grounds, make them chair or coordinator or facilitator of the Buildings and Grounds Task Force and not necessarily put them on a vestry. If you have 5 or 7 or 9 people who are faithful and committed and participating members of the congregation who get this vision thing, who get this idea of strategic thinking, those are the people you put on the vestry. You know, you could ask people, you know, the numbers person could be a treasurer and not be on the vestry. The person who loves kids could be in charge of Christian education or youth programs. But if they don't get the big picture and vision thing, I would say they're not prime candidates for the vestry. And we have to be much more deliberate about who we put on our leadership teams. And it has to be a group of people who, in partnership with the rector, could engage in this ongoing process of strategic thinking, mission articulation, vision articulation, and coming up with measurable goals and strategies. Okay. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left. Any pushback? Does this make sense? Can anyone share their own experience in some of these areas? Patience. Change doesn't come easily for many. Yeah, and I'll admit that I'm not the most patient person in the world, and I'm not a person, for me, process leads to product. But the older I get, and after being in this organization for 10 years, I really think that this ongoing process of strategic thinking, of evaluating and reevaluating what you're doing, this goes back to the classic line, this isn't the way we've done things here. Or if you've done it this way and it isn't working, maybe it's time to change. Sounds like a program-sized church governance. Are you talking about my concept of vestry members? Yes. Yeah, and often the pushback I'll get is saying, oh yeah, Donald, that's all well and good if you have, 150 or 250 people in church on a Sunday. But what about if you have a congregation of an average Sunday attendance of 35, and you need to put together a vestry who's going to make sure the operation's moving forward? That's a good point. And you don't have the luxury of having, the buildings and grounds task force, the youth committee task force and all that. I fully appreciate their capacity issues. But in those situations, I still think that even in a congregation with an average Sunday attendance of 35, there should be 3 people, 5 people. There's no magic number. And I don't know, I know maybe your bishops would say differently, but if you could only find 5 people who have this sense of vision, have a vestry of 5 people. And people do have to multitask. But the way I think you get around that is you make sure you design your vestry agendas, even if it's a working vestry, and the people on the vestry are doing the work of the parish. They're not just the big thinkers. But if you design your vestry agenda so that at every vestry meeting, people step back from their normal roles and engage in some sense of visioning, discernment, strategic thinking, faith sharing, you'll be surprised how that simple process changes the dynamic. And you do that at the beginning of the meeting where people are still fresh and energetic. And then you get to the nuts and bolts and meat of, the building needs work or the grass needs cutting. But a lot is how you design your vestry meeting, whether you're a corporate-sized church or a family-sized church. It changes the dynamic. It really does. Anybody else? Well, as you can see that I am passionate about this subject. ECF is passionate about this subject. We do have resources available. We have a strategic solutions program. We have some tools and resources on our Vital Practices website. You can contact us if you want to know what else we can do to help. We do offer facilitation and assistance. We do vestry retreats. We do visioning sessions. We can get on the phone and just talk through some of these concepts, especially if you're a smaller congregation with fewer resources. But it's a very important process. Let's see. How can you bring discernment and Bible study into a vestry meeting without it running long? Well, for example, if your standing items are, finance report, buildings and grounds report, program report, I don't know. First of all, one of the things is you kind of utilize a consent agenda. So if there's nothing really major going on that month, you have a written report, you receive and file it, and if people want to put it on the discussion list, that's one thing. So So you don't necessarily have to talk about all the same things every month. And if your vestry meeting is an hour and a half, I don't know, or an hour, or I'm sure some vestry meetings go on forever. Um, so take 45 minutes for some of this Bible study, faith sharing, strategic stuff, and take another half hour, 45 minutes for the business stuff. And you'll find that people are going to be much more engaged in that early part of the meeting. It works every time. Where can we get more info on using consent agenda? Be in touch with us. We do have our vestry resource guide has some good suggestions on how to structure an agenda, how to do a consent agenda. Vestry resource guide, we just totally revised it. It's hot off the press and has a lot of good suggestions in this area. There's also some articles. Yeah, no, Hillary, where are you on the story? Where did we see God this week? And it's amazing how a Bible study, even with simple questions like that, also change the tone of the meeting. So those people who come to a vestry meeting kind of fit to be tied or angry or have an axe to grind, if they're asked where do they see God in the story or where do they see God this week, all of a sudden that anger, that anxiety will dissipate into much more of a spirit-filled process.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to be mindful of the time, and we're wrapping up. As Donald mentioned, you see the information if you're curious about contacting us more about strategic solutions. I also just want to quickly highlight as well, before we conclude, that we have a variety of other webinars, continuing this 3 more that are on the schedule for October. We are delighted to be able to collaborate with other organizations and leaders in the Episcopal Church to offer some fabulous content. One I would like to highlight for you is Digital Giving Models and Tools with Kyle Oliver of the Center for the Ministry of Teaching at Virginia Theological Seminary. We also are doing a webinar with ERD next month on the Episcopal Asset Map, so check that out on our website. I also will just put up our contact information. As Donald mentioned, we are here for you, and we would love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media as well. And one final note mentioned as well, that we will have a survey that will be landing in your inbox within a moment. Please take a moment to fill this out. Your feedback helps us determine what we offer in our webinars and to be able to strengthen presentations such as this. So thank you, Donald, for this enlightening webinar. This was wonderful. Thank you all for your questions, your comments. This is what fuels us for presenting with this. We thank you for taking this time out of your day to participate in these important issues within our congregations. So God bless, Godspeed in your ministry, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you very much, and good luck and God bless.